Okay. All good, Ralph?
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining tonight. Really appreciate it, and hopefully get to chat to you all in a wee bit. I was saying for Ralph earlier that this is probably closer to an hour than an hour and a half. And hopefully no one will be too upset about that, and you can carry on with your evenings. But just thought I'd give you a heads up at the start. Um, as Ralph said, we're kind of titled it Preparing Athletes for Competition, but with a more holistic approach and kind of looking more from a um, performance lifestyle or whatever you want to call it, practitioner point of view. Um, my name is Nuala. I'm currently a player development manager for Scottish Rugby. Um, I've been here for kind of year and a half, and prior to that, I was working with what was the English Institute of Sport in performance lifestyle for 4 years or so. Um, and in terms of, I'll give you like my background in terms of preparing athletes for competition. I'll tell you this just so that if you've got kind of questions specific to this, then this might um, uh, plant a seed regarding those. So I worked at Glasgow Commonwealth Games in kind of medical and anti-doping side. In London, I worked in the GB House, where kind of friends and family of athletes go. In Rio Games, I worked at the prep camp, so the kind of in Brazil before athletes go into the games, and in Tokyo, I was in the village in the kind of apartments that GB were staying in. So my focus or my bias kind of accidentally does tend to be more major games. But I have also worked with junior athletes. I was team manager for Scottish Diving, so worked with some of their juniors and under 18s in those environments. And I've also personally been a student athlete in the States for 4 years, down in Loughborough for a year, and then playing international rugby while working full time in London. So hopefully different prep for different competitions along the way. But yeah, just thought I'd give you that background so you can know what to ask me and also what to avoid asking me. Um, I just thought I'd start um, by going around you guys, if that's okay, just to hear a little bit more about your context. Obviously, I've written this presentation, but if we can adapt it as I go in terms of making it specific as possible to the context you guys have got, then that would be brilliant. So if you don't mind, we'll kind of go through. How many have we got? About 11? We could probably just go through everyone if that's okay. If you can just give me an idea quickly of your name, kind of where and who you're working with, and any upcoming competitions those athletes or teams have got, just so I've got a few kind of competitions in my mind that we might kind of refer to. Um, so if that's okay, do you want me to name and shame, or do you want to just go for
I said name and shame.
it? Okay, well, Alice is top of my list. Alice, do you want to go?
Yeah, of course, I'll kick us off. So I'm Alice, currently working at Everton Football Club, working with the women's senior team, so support all the athletes and support the staff with that as well, and then oversee psych that happens at lower levels delivered by other psychologists. Guess upcoming competitions, we've got 3 games left in the season, so we're sort of towards the end of the season. And then the majority of our players will be going to the Women's World Cup as well, representing various different countries. So I guess whilst they're not sort of directly within my role at Everton, they're not for Everton, it's something that's definitely on everyone's mind. So that's sort of probably the big one for me at the minute, as the season sort of like is so close to ending.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Alison Brown, you're next on my list. You want to just introduce yourself?
Hi, I'll keep this brief because I'm on the train. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, brilliant.
So I'm the head of personal development at TAS, so no specific competitions as such. We're just part of the team that has oversight for the whole of the TAS programme, so 500-600 plus athletes.
You're not supporting them all individually, those 600 plus. No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Greg, do you want to kick off next?
There we go. Hi, all right. I'm Greg. I work at Northumbria University and I work with the Sports Scholars and TAS Athletes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Greg. I thought I recognised your name and I do recognise your face, yeah. Next on my list is Joseph. Oh, I think you're talking, but we can't hear you, Joseph. It might be the IT that's not conforming, I think. Yeah. Okay, 2 seconds. If we move on to Lynn, do you want to just introduce yourself while we're waiting?
Hi everybody, my name's Lynn Turton. I work at University of Nottingham. I predominantly look after the younger table tennis and squash athletes, so preparing them for their national competitions, etc.
Brilliant, thank you. I think Joseph's still working, so we'll go on to Millie, if that's okay.
Hiya. So I'm Millie. I'm a sports nutritionist and I work with Bristol Bears Women's Rugby, Seven Stars Netball, Oxford United FC, TAS Athletes. Yeah, sort of quite random. Competitions, the Bears have got 4 last games left. So in the Allianz League, so that will then decide if we're placing. So we're currently 4th. Obviously, the aim is to come first, but yeah, we'll see. The Oxford United have just finished their league, so they're done, and Seven Stars are just finishing their season as well. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Grand, thank you. And as an ex-Wasps player, I won't hold it against you that you're working with Bristol. We've got a few of our old players even, so it's all
Yeah,
good.
we get a lot of crossover from Worcester and Wasps actually. I don't know if it's like one of the nearest, but yeah.
Yeah, it's all just concentrated in that south, but I won't get political about the rugby. Okay. Thanks, really. Joe, are you back? Oh, sorry.
I
Is
think
he
so.
typing
Can
wrong?
you hear me now?
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
yeah,
spot
sorry
on.
about that. Working my tech out. Yeah, thanks for your patience. Sorry. Yeah, my name's Joe. I'm performance sport manager and TAS delivery site lead at the University of East Anglia. So I have a few programs here. Obviously, we have up to a very few 4 TAS athletes at the moment, but also a number of university scholars. So most of the sort of university season coming to an end. But in my sort of other hat on, I'm also a coach for England Corfball Academy, working sort of 15 to 19-year-olds. So yeah, there's a few competitions upcoming, and we've got another sort of academy session before the sort of under 17s and under 19s go out to European Championships and things like that. So for dual hat, it'll be quite useful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Glad we got you to join us in the end. Phil. Oh, I think you're on mute as well.
There we go, technology. Yeah, so my name's Phil. I'm the TDS lead for Manchester Met University. We have currently 19 TAS students, but I oversee our WSL link with Man City as well as our main scholars. Most of my athletes Manchester Thunder, their season is kind of coming to an end or has ended with the age group we're working with. And then most of like Joe said, most of our students have finished their book season and kind of winding down to the summer months.
Brilliant. Thank you. Appreciate that, Phil. And then Kristen, I've got.
Evening, I'm Tristan. I'm based at the University of Cambridge. I'm the fitness and strength and conditioning manager there. So we work with a range of teams and individual athletes. As previously been said, our teams are pretty much finished, but lots of competitions for our individual athletes, from athletics to fencing to goalball and various other things in between. So that's me.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Alex Wint, I think you joined us during this. Did you get the brief or did you miss it?
Oh yeah. I've got Sorry, I'm
Great.
the problem. I do apologise.
No problem.
I'm Alex. I'm based over at Loughborough College. So we cover a range of different TAS athletes, with links to Leicester City Women's, handball, etc. So yeah, we've got a whole variety of different athletes at the moment. That are sort of currently we've got a few GB guys, elite GB guys that are sort of going into training camps at the moment. And then for the other guys, they're sort of just winding down towards the end of their season. So yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you. Is there anyone I've missed? Give me a shout. Otherwise, we'll move on. Brilliant. Okay. So just a wee bit of a plan for this evening. As I say, probably won't keep you the whole time, but just so you know kind of what's coming up. So the whole plan really is how we can support and help athletes, and the kind of areas we're going to look at are facilitating robust planning. Like I says, like it says there, sorry, this isn't probably the sexiest element. This is probably the more the lists and checklists and more lists, but it can make an impact. And I think, you know, we hear a lot in sport about controlling the controllables, and this is certainly something that we can help athletes with. But we will also look at kind of sparking some conversations. So this is kind of the kind of delving into some of the deeper stuff that's probably a bit more job satisfaction for you and hopefully helpful for athletes as well. This is kind of assuming stroke hoping that you get to work with some athletes on a one-to-one basis rather than just having to kind of send emails out to shed loads of people. And then kind of the overall aim of this really is to increase the athlete's confidence. I think the more confident they are in their preparation, the more focus they can have on their performance. But we'll also be looking at not just performance, but their experience and their future prospects as well. I think, you know, we've kind of come from a bit of a society in the UK of medals at all costs into this kind of medals and more, where yes, we want athletes to succeed, but we need to look at their overall experience and how they're finding that as well. And if we are putting athletes into situations they've never been into before, into different countries or different levels of competition, then how can we best prepare them so that the overall experience is still positive regardless of the result, which might ultimately be at least partly out of their control. And how we're planning to cover those topics is in terms of myself sharing experience with you from some of the roles that I mentioned previously. I will give you some examples of athletes and things that I've encountered previously. Sometimes I'll sort of name the athlete in the sport, and other times we'll just kind of keep some of the confidentiality, but hopefully those experiences will be useful. I'll also share some of the tools that I've used personally or other people have shared with me and I've experienced that I think have been useful over the years. And most importantly, I'd really like there to be some discussion and questions. Please interrupt me anytime. We're a relatively small group, which is quite nice in terms of being able to interact. And the reason this is really important, this discussion and question section, is because thanks for sharing everything you just have in terms of giving me a wee bit of your context, but I certainly don't know your context really intimately. So it's good that we can kind of chat about my experience, but then also make sure that that is applicable to where you're at. I'm conscious that, I mean, there's a real array of different sports and things people are working with, which is brilliant. And I'm conscious that within those sports and different setups, there'll be really different kind of support teams, levels of funding, that sort of thing. So you might be a jack of all trades helping athletes with a lot of things, or you might be a cog in a pretty massive machine. So feel free to interject with any questions around that sort of stuff and to flex to what is relevant to your context. Just checking. Yeah, I think also it's just worth saying at this point that at the most basic level, this presentation could have just been a series of checklists and that you could just send out, like I've said. But hopefully it'll be a little bit more than that, and we can kind of use the principles of coaching where you're kind of assuming that the athletes have a lot of the answers that they're looking for, and you're just the person kind of facilitating that conversation so that they can kind of organize those answers nice and neatly, and you're giving them an opportunity to kind of verbalize those ahead of time. So yeah, any questions before we begin? Anyone? Okay. I think in the description of this presentation, I promised Ralph that I would start with the end in mind. So I'll do that and just look at post-comp first, if we're thinking chronologically. And the reason that I'm doing this is because this has probably been my most successful workshop I've delivered to athletes in terms of coaches letting me do it. So there's lots of things that I've said to coaches or performance directors or whoever's in charge, please can I do a workshop with the athletes on preparing for travel or on jet lag or on whatever it is, and they go, yeah, that's brilliant, we'll schedule you in for 2 weeks before we fly. And then when the time comes, there's an extra training session, or people are injured, or people can't come, and things get prioritized basically. And for lack of better technical term, coaches get a bit twitchy closer to an event. So I found that doing this kind of presentation or workshop with athletes and teams kind of 4 to 6 months prior to the competition can be really helpful, because at that point coaches are under a little bit less stress and people just generally seem to have a little bit more time, or indeed they kind of protect that time, and that's okay. So when I do a post-competition workshop, what I'd be looking to do within that is aim to develop a personal and a sport plan. So if we kind of are showing, let's see if I can get this feature to work. We move from here down to these three and then back up to this. I was very excited about the new features on Teams. Anyway, so in terms of the sport plan, we might be looking at the logistics of what's happening post-comp. So are they moving to other competitions? Are they going straight from the Worlds onto the Olympics? Are they going straight from Bucks Winter Games into something else? Or from a regular Premier League game into a championship game? So just kind of looking at what's coming up next for them, and making sure that we're starting with the end in mind, keeping that kind of on our mind when we're making our plans. Then also, sorry, just looking at the sport plan, my notes have kind of moved about there. Also just kind of looking at what might be the next goal from a sporting perspective, and if there is an opportunity in the season to rest and recover, or if you're going straight on to the next thing. The personal plan we'd be looking to develop would be more in terms of, are we switching focus from sport at that point back to something else like studying, employment, scholarship application, whatever it is? Are there particular events that are coming up straight afterwards, family events, weddings, etc., that we're needing to get back for? And kind of once we've considered the sport and personal calendars and schedules, then we're kind of looking at, okay, what's going to be best for us? So this is assuming that the competition we're referring to in this instance is the pinnacle of some kind. So do we want to arrange some sort of downtime afterwards? So in terms of the travel aspect, are we going to travel onwards? Are we going to stay in the country we've been competing in to have a holiday there? Or are we going to get home and then have a holiday planned to go on to? One of the reasons that it's good to plan this now is the final point in the slide there that says exposure is kind of one of the things that's always stuck with me when I was working with Will Bailey from Para Table Tennis. When he won his gold in Rio, it was his first gold he'd won. It was the highest heights he'd reached. but he hadn't planned for that kind of spike in interest from the media. And when he got home, he kind of just went into a wee bit of a recluse, and didn't really engage with any of the media opportunities that were there. Now that's fine, some people want to do that, but in hindsight, Will said to me that he really regretted that. And para-table tennis, by his own admission, is not #1 sport in Great Britain most of the time. So that's kind of your one time every 4 years to really kind of optimize that interest level. And maybe that's not for some of you that are working in football and things, when there's general kind of year-round interest, but still when there's Women's Euros or World Cup or something, then there is heightened exposure. And sometimes it's just worth planning. Actually, maybe I want to have my calendar blocked out in terms of being free for a week or two after the event, so that if I'm given the opportunity to go onto this programme or to speak on this radio station or whatever it is, then actually I can do it because I haven't booked my flights to X holiday to rest straight afterwards. Like I say, it's not for everyone, but it's just worth considering because, like I say, I know people who have kind of regretted not considering that in the past. And then just going back over to the corner with the setting the scene, is I try and talk to all athletes before pinnacle kind of competition about what we would refer to as post-games blues, and how they might feel after the event. And that's not necessarily to do with how well they've done at the event. It could have been that they've done very well, but just that returning home, returning to normality can be very difficult. And I've spoken to some athletes before that have really thought that this wouldn't affect them and they would kind of be immune to this, and then they've been surprised that it has hit them. And some people, when you say athletes, when you explain this to them, they kind of talk about, oh no, well, I've got a holiday planned, I did that thing that you said to me, so that's fine. But that's like a little bit of a band-aid on the situation. So you might come down off this high of being at the Games or World Cup or whatever your pinnacle is. You might go on your 2-week holiday and that's brilliant, but then what's next? And I think anyone who's maybe got married or been on a honeymoon or anything like that might feel the same, is that you're kind of in this amazing place, but then you're led back to reality, and integration back into quote unquote normal life can be a little bit challenging. And it's just worth thinking through how that might impact you, how you can work to kind of reduce the impact of that, and some strategies that you might implement, and that'll be different for everyone. But certainly for athletes that have been to the Games, Olympic or Paralympic Games, then you are kind of treated differently in that space, and similarly in World Cups and things. And kind of coming back home and just being a normal person, not being put on a pedestal, not having dinner made for you, not having your laundry done, all those kind of things can be a little bit difficult. And I find that if you try and speak to athletes about this a week before they leave or a couple of weeks before they leave, they just don't have the headspace or the capacity to consider this. But if you're able to do this, like I say, several months prior to departure, then you can sometimes get into some really good discussions, and then it's just a matter of documenting that however is best for the athletes, so that if they do kind of stumble on those trickier times when they come back, then you might be able to meet with them and say, we did discuss this, and these are some of the strategies we talked about, and these are some of the things you had planned, and this is what you put in place. So yeah, a little bit of a back to front there by going post-comp, but hopefully that makes sense as to why I did it, just in terms of the timeline of delivery with athletes. Any questions as I say it, I'm going, just give me a shout. Okay, so this is the absolute basics in terms of preparing athletes for competition. I really hope this doesn't come across as patronising for me to kind of mention that you might want to give an athlete a list. But I think we've probably all known athletes that are disorganized or don't have their passports or something like that, and coaches and things as well. So whilst this is the absolute basics, I think that if we don't get this right, then we are kind of doing ourselves a bit of a disservice. So it's not a bad place to start. Ideally, we'd be kind of looking to do this a few weeks before travel. So this is much closer as opposed to the post-games planning or post-competition planning, sorry. So in terms of lists we might want to write for athletes, the documents they need to take is probably up there. So obviously passports, but also do they need visa? Oh, sorry, in terms of passport, also looking at the expiry date. I've had athletes, just professional athletes, I might add, mentioning offhand that their passport's away just now because the expiry date was coming up, but they think it'll get back before the World Cup. And then, you know, you've had to pull a few strings with the embassy and try and get things expedited. But hopefully you're not having to do that personally. But yeah, including that on the list, it's always handy. Insurance, photocopies of documents, not just the documents themselves, always handy. Credit cards that they can use. This, we're looking at just medications. Obviously, you'd hope people would have that with you, but just depending on the different countries you're traveling to, it's worth considering whether you need to have the prescription or a doctor's note with you, depending on what that is. Sometimes it can be a really innocuous medication, but just the country you're traveling to means that they want quite a lot of documentation around that. Obviously, if you've got athletes that are on ADAMS or have anti-doping responsibilities, then they'll need to have all those documented. But even for people who aren't on ADAMS, it's pretty handy just to have a note on your phone with your any medication you're taking, the dose, etc. Electricals, just in terms of adapters, tablets, chargers, but also just considering any kind of change in wattage, like will your kettle work in that country, for example, because it's all very well good taking it, but not if it explodes the plug. And then my wee brew here was just to kind of signify other things that you might have listed. And food and drink is normally pretty high up there because there's a lot of countries that don't consider English breakfast tea as a staple. I actually don't drink tea and coffee, but I'm reluctant to admit that because people normally think that makes me pretty strange. But a lot of people like taking that on their travels. And aside from food and drink, just other things that kind of give that home from home feel. Even if you're going to a Commonwealth Games in Birmingham and it's still within your country, for example, then there's something about being in a kind of dorm room that feels a little bit alien. So sometimes it's just a case of taking your own pillowcase, some pictures, some cards, blue tack to put those up with, just those wee bits and pieces that don't actually take up much space in your luggage but can really make a difference to how at home you're feeling, your anxiety levels, that sort of thing. Let me just move this along. Okay, so this is still under organisation, but more kind of considerations rather than things that are just 100% you need to bring, get it on a list, tick it off as you go. This is more something that if you have the chance to actually chat to the athlete, rather than just kind of sending it cold, then this would be a good thing to do. And like I say, not necessarily must-haves, but something more to kind of discuss. So the first one there is an on-flight plan. So just thinking about how you're going to approach this. Again, if it's like, you know, an hour on the train to Birmingham or a 1 hour flight to Paris, that is maybe a little bit different than flying to Tokyo. Oh, sorry, Alex, yeah. What's your question?
I do apologise. I can't actually see the presentation on the screen. I'm not sure if anyone else got this technical issue. I just can't see anything.
Okay, is anyone else able to see this?
I can see it clearly.
Yeah, I can see it as well.
Okay, sorry about that, Alex. We'll send it to you afterwards.
Yeah, no worries.
Or maybe if you want to leave and come back in, then we'll promise to let you in, if that helps. Thanks for letting me know though, and yeah, give me a shout if anything else isn't clear. I've tried not to put too much information on the slides, so it's not kind of death by writing, but it is death by my voice instead. So, so yeah, for the on-flight plan. Hopefully this will work for you now, Alex. Just looking at things like, infection control. Are you going to have wipes with you? Are you going to have first defense nasal spray with you, that sort of thing? But also, are you going to have kind of noise cancelling headphones, downloading programs, podcasts, that sort of thing? Are you going to bring your own food rather than trusting the airline food, which is good for everyone, not just athletes, I think? Spare kit, are you going to pack kind of one competition kit just in case your other bags get lost, that sort of thing? And then also sometimes a bit of a plan as to, are you hoping to sleep for the whole flight? Have you considered jet lag? How's that going to work for you? Okay, Alex, you're in. That's brilliant. This isn't necessarily a plan that's just going to be between you and the athlete. This might be something that you're doing with a physiologist or a physiotherapist. Certainly, some of you guys that are working in kind of better funded sports might have people that are doing this, which is brilliant, but it might even just be up to yourself to kind of ask the question of, have you made that plan, rather than running through it with the athlete. But yeah, you might be the person coordinating rather than doing it. From a luggage point of view, the main thing is really just about personalizing your luggage, especially if you're traveling with a big team and everyone's got a kind of GB suitcase or whatever it is. Then what makes yours stand out, so you're not kind of getting anxious as the conveyor belt's going round. Other considerations around travel insurance, also language. I don't think anyone's expecting people to become fluent in the language of their destination, but sometimes having a few basic phrases, having Google Translate handy on your phone or another app that will kind of work for you, or maybe doing, kind of a week or two of Duolingo before you depart can be handy to just give that kind of home from home feel as well. Immunizations, just making sure you've got kind of a good record of those, even if you are up to date or there's nothing extra required, the sort of thing that's just always handy. Currency, I know we kind of use physical cash a lot less now, but it's worth just sometimes having a little bit, whether that's the specific athlete or whether that's someone within the team, just in terms of if you're in a culture that has tipping, or if you arrive at the airport and you need some cash to operate the cart, then you're kind of stumped at the first hurdle. So that's always worth considering. Obviously, athletes will be on their phones, so just implications of that, and whether they need to look at any roaming charges or, yeah, any kind of big bills that might be incoming if they're streaming while they're there. And then the last thing I was thinking of was just whether for some athletes you might be working with, this could be their first time away from home abroad. For a lot of your athletes, it won't be, and they'll be really well versed and better than some of us even. But for some athletes, it will be. And so for them, it could just be those basic reminders of, telling neighbours that they're going away, putting their heating on holiday mode, all those sort of basic things that you and I might take for granted. But if they're a younger athlete or kind of independent for the first time, then it's worth considering. Also for athletes on Adams, then just remembering about changing their whereabouts as well. Hopefully you're not doing that for them. Hopefully they're able to do that themselves, but a reminder is always good. I didn't want to kind of patronize anyone by showing them how to write a list, but I thought I would just kind of give an example of some of the kind of checklists we've used before that sometimes just have like different names up here, as well as maybe like action and whether it's been completed or not, that sort of thing, because sometimes the roles that we might be playing, like I was saying, is we're the ones kind of going through it all or centralizing this information with the athletes, but we're not necessarily the one responsible. So sometimes this kind of layout can just be useful in terms of agreeing responsibility, so that it's nice and clear for the athlete and something that they can kind of take away with them, and also keeps your conscience clear in terms of what was your responsibility or not. Okay, we're moving a wee bit away from lists and getting on to the good stuff now. So yeah, beyond just kind of checking off items, we're still looking at planning within this slide. But this is more to just kind of have conversations initially with athletes, and then those might move into written plans depending on which athlete you're working with, the amount of time you have, and the other practitioners they're working with. So when we're looking at communication, particularly for those events that are kind of major events and away from home, then it's worth considering what the athlete's contact with home will be like, and vice versa. So it might be that the athlete is like, no, I don't contact home for the whole time I'm away, and that's the way it is. But it's worth chatting about how that will be experienced by the other people, as in their mum or caregiver or partner, whoever it is. If they're normally only away for a few days at a time and they're going away for, say, a 3-week stint because it's a World Cup and there's time to acclimatise, then actually that usual tactic that they use might be not appreciated by the other party. So just kind of having that conversation to consider what that'll be like. Also taking into consideration things like time difference, competition schedule, Wi-Fi availability, that sort of thing. I found also sometimes useful chatting through if there's a bit of a plan in terms of the result, and this can be different if you're just going and playing one game or if you're part of a competition. So particularly for the latter, if you've had a bad result, for example, do you want to hear from home? Would you rather not? Would you rather there's anything they did or didn't say? Sometimes it's just worth having these conversations when you've got a little bit of capacity to have them, rather than in the moment and then you feel like something has impacted your next performance. So just being really kind of thorough with the comms planning. Another thing is just whether you want to nominate anyone at home that can kind of be the person that answers all your friends and family who come out the woodwork because you're playing on the big stage for the first time and they want to know how they can watch. And hopefully it'll be something really easy, like on the BBC, but if it is via a link or via this YouTube channel or whatever it is, then you don't necessarily want to be asking those questions when you are in competition and trying to focus on performance. So sometimes it's worth just putting someone else in charge, and they can kind of help friends and family that come out the woodwork appropriately, and also say, no, sorry, we can't get you any tickets. So moving on to environmental, just considerations around heat, humidity, cold, jet lag, all that sort of thing. Again, if you've got a physiologist, they'll be looking at this. But if you don't, and if you've had an athlete that's not experienced these things before, then it's something to look at. From a media point of view, just worth considering in advance what approach you will take to social media. It might be that you really don't post much throughout the year and that will continue over this period. But sometimes people do have quite a different approach to social media during major events than they do the rest of the year. So it's worth just having more of a deliberate plan about that. Depending on the scale of the event, it can also be worth chatting to people at home about what you kind of would or wouldn't like them to say if the media gets in touch with them. I think we've all seen it at Olympics and Paralympics, particularly when there's a big time difference and it's quite hard to get kind of live footage of athlete interviews. They'll kind of go around to Adam Peaty's mum's house and get their chat, and sometimes it's brilliant and it's heartfelt, and sometimes it's kind of car crash. So it might be worth having a chat to people at home about what would be a good idea to say or not say. Moving across to brand, just considering any kind of sponsorship expectations or limitations. And that might be your own personal sponsorship, so things that you need to remember to promote while you're out there, whether it's just one Instagram post or whatever it is. But it could also be limitations. So if you're normally Nuladin's individual athlete, but you're there under the guise of Team GB or whatever it is, then it might be that you can't wear your normal Nike products or whatever. There's always someone who breaks these rules, so it's just best to try and make sure that it's not one of your athletes and they're at least aware of the rules before they go out there. Looking at rest and recovery. So a couple of things I thought I'd put under this heading. So one is considering what sleeping arrangements will be at the competition. So sometimes it's room sharing. If it is, it's typically your athlete will have done this before, but perhaps it's with someone they haven't shared with before. And if they haven't, then is there anything they need to consider around that? Also, in terms of recovery, just considering nutrition and any supplementary products that they need to bring with them. Also, for para athletes, sometimes worth thinking about any mobility aids they might need, particularly at the Paralympics. Sometimes at other major events, there's a lot more kind of walking or travel between things than they would normally do in kind of everyday life. So even though they might not normally be a chair user or not normally use an electric scooter or whatever it is, then sometimes for those events, it is worth considering whether that would make a difference, because you don't want your step count to suddenly increase hugely and impact your performance. And then the bread and butter for most kind of people working in performance lifestyle is just helping athletes manage their other responsibilities. So what might they be missing while they're away at competition in terms of employment, education, or other important events like graduation, family celebrations, that sort of thing. Just making sure all the dots are crossed, T's are crossed, I's are dotted in that respect. Okay, so I think I said the last stuff was the good stuff, but this is actually the good stuff. So if you are, I think Alice, you said you were sports psych as well, but if you have a psych that you work with, and this is certainly something you would be doing alongside them if they weren't doing it. But if you aren't in that position, then this is something that you can kind of get stuck into with athletes as well, particularly if they don't have loads of other support staff at their disposal. So the kind of starting point in terms of understanding self and those around you could be with some sort of personality profiling. So that could be something simple like MBTI. Pretty sure you can just access Myers-Briggs stuff online if you don't have anything else, but you may have done Insights or Spotlight or anything like that. And just the opportunity for athletes to do that and reflect on that can be really useful, and particularly if they're able to kind of have a conversation with someone like yourself who's maybe just asking them open questions about what seemed to ring true for them, anything that surprised them, anything that particularly stuck out for them. And then thinking about how we can use those results to share with other people. So there might be some part of those results from the profiling that they want to keep confidential, and that's absolutely grand. And we certainly don't want to share 10-page documents with everyone on their team or more widely. But how can we best share that? I had a really good example of that when I was working with British Canoeing at the prep camp in Rio, where they kind of, as I turned up, having never met any of these athletes or staff before, they gave me kind of 10 cue cards that basically had the athlete's face. The background of the card was the colour of their preference, so kind of yellow, red, blue, green. And they just had some really quick bullet points about what triggers that athlete had, what to say to them after performance, what not to say to them after performance, and how to interact with them on a good day or a bad day. And it was kind of just really quick. You could read through that within less than 10 minutes, but it just meant that you weren't kind of going into that situation cold in terms of knowing how to deal with that athlete in what is quite a high pressure situation. So having someone that can create those kind of resources, those kind of summaries, is really helpful if you're kind of willing to step up and do that. Or it might just be something that you can suggest to the team that you work with or to the athletes that you work with, that any way they can distill down what they've learned from their personal profiling into some sort of shared summary can be really useful for the people around them. To just accelerate that relationship in that pressurized environment. This could be in addition to this, looking at the next two things, so the energy plan, self-care plan, or it could just be standalone. So these are just other examples I've seen different teams and athletes come up with. So some people have written out energy plans for each athlete. So the sort of things that come up on those are things like what a good day looks like for you versus a bad day, so that someone could kind of observe your behaviors, non-verbal cues, and automatically tell if you're having a good day or a bad day. Obviously, there's kind of common ones with that, but there might be some that are less obvious that it's worth just writing down. And then just kind of highlighting what gives energy to you and what zaps energy to you. So the most common thing with that would be, you know, whether you're stereotypically an introvert or an extrovert. Do you like spending time with people, time alone? But we can go a wee bit deeper than that and kind of discuss what really fills you up, fills up your bucket, and what kind of drains you. Also considering who they would go to for support, and what practices do they use to manage stress and to boost their energy. And sometimes that is for other people to read and to know about them, but sometimes that can also be just a little prompt for them to kind of say, okay, I am pretty low energy, I'm pretty low mood, but this is something I know works for me. It's tried and tested method. I've written it down here. Let's give that a bash. Self-care plan, there's certainly crossover, but some of the things I've seen in that can be more about kind of what triggers you to feel stressed and what coping strategies do you have in place to manage these, and particularly when you're in an unfamiliar environment. So it's all kind of very well saying, oh, well, I normally do this, I normally take time out here, or I normally speak to this person, but those strategies aren't always available, particularly when we're considering time difference or location. So this is kind of a self-care plan that isn't year-round, but specific to the event and the location that you're about to go to, just to make sure that you have considered that prior to it happening real time, and then all of your usual strategies seem to be out the window. And then the last one is just about managing relationships, and then so that is kind of the understanding team bit and understanding others bit of this section. So we always like to kind of start with understanding ourselves, but if the athletes haven't put a huge deal of time into understanding those around them that they're traveling with and who they're probably going to be spending a lot of time with, then we can see the demise of that quite quickly. So it's worth considering the different relationships that will be there. So obviously teammates, you know, whether they play in a team sport or they have synchro partners or doubles partners, but also just considering whether they have siblings competing, sometimes have that, whether they have partners competing, just about thinking how they will manage that relationship, and again, specific to this context. So I worked with a couple of athletes before that had been in a relationship for a long time, and you know, it was a very good, solid relationship, but this was the first time they'd been to a multi-games event where they were both competing in different sports, and essentially one of them was doing very well results-wise as the week was going on, and the other one was doing the opposite, both in terms of results, but also in terms of injury and their own kind of personal performance. And that was something they hadn't really encountered before, was supporting one person who's in some ways failing, and while also trying to celebrate the other person's success. So just kind of looking at some of those scenarios that aren't maybe in your day-to-day relationships can be a worthwhile exercise prior to travel. And then this slide was just about kind of clarity. So I would see these kind of things as the icing on the cake rather than the kind of flour and sugar and the list stuff that we started with. But, you know, a lot of us are working in high performance sport, and if we're looking for those 1% gains, then I think these little 1% gains can still hold importance. So things to kind of discuss with athletes, so team rules and agreements. The reason I put this one in is because when I was in Tokyo working in the village, there was an athlete who it was their first time games, and I ended up kind of running alongside them to try and catch the bus because their whole team had left without them. They were running kind of 2 minutes late, but they had no idea where to get the bus from. They missed the bus, no idea when the next bus was. Were they going to miss their practice session? Were they going to miss their competition itself? Anyone who's been to any sort of major competition will know that transport is never straightforward and it's never just about kind of grabbing a taxi. It can often be more complex than that. And when the sport reflected on this, they were kind of like, actually, it should be one of our team rules that we don't leave until we have everyone. And that might seem kind of basic, but it was from an individual sport. So they don't always travel kind of in that way. And sometimes just setting these out to start, just make sure that everyone is on the same page. And instead of them being kind of unwritten rules that everyone really knows, but it's not official, sometimes actually writing them down can be helpful. Support available is another good thing to consider from the point of view of this could be very different to what it is the rest of the year. So you might have your own personal masseuse. I don't know what sport you're in if you do, but maybe you do, and that's very fortunate. But when you're at major games, you won't. Or it could be the other way around, where you don't normally have your own physio, but there is a physio available at the major event you're going to. So just kind of comparing and contrasting what you have that's normal, what is outside the norm, and how you can best utilize that. It may be that there's some staff that aren't traveling, but actually you can still contact them remotely at home, and just knowing that and making sure that you are kind of making use of that while you're still out at competition can be really helpful. Also, another example of when I was in Tokyo is it was for the first time we'd had specific mental health support. So we had a psychiatrist on site for the first time. And I did have a couple of athletes ask me for help with certain things that were outside my remit, and it was really, really nice for me for the first time to be able to say, actually, I can point you in this direction and you can speak to this particular person. For one athlete, it was a problem that they were experiencing personally, but for another athlete, it was to help them support their roommate who'd been having panic attacks, and they were looking for specific help with that. So important for you to know what support is available, and then to pass that information on to the athlete and to make sure that they're kind of using it in the best way possible. Also worth considering anything kind of event specific. So we talked about sponsorship restrictions, that sort of thing that might be different to any other event. Culture specific. So again, earlier we spoke about tipping, but it could be something to do with how you're dressing or how you're eating, just those other considerations. There's nothing else that kind of throws you off. And then a big thing for me would just be learning from other athletes. Most people will hopefully be in a situation where their athlete will know someone else who has been to that competition previously. There might be some who are treading new waters, which is really exciting. But even if it's someone from a different sport, is there anyone else they can speak to that can kind of answer any of their questions, or kind of put any of their worries to rest? I think as much as I was previously an athlete, and I'm sure a lot of you were as well, it's different listening to me than it is listening to a current athlete. So yeah, that's always a good tool if you have that available to you. And then just other things to consider, but in more of a kind of review way than a discussion way perhaps, is just the expectations. And this is probably just an opportunity for the athlete to kind of explain it back to you, but it gives them the chance to do that. So this isn't something where you would have the information. This is really just a chance for them to kind of verbalize it. So looking at what their targets are with the sport, what commitments they've made, any codes of conduct that they've signed and maybe not read the small print, just looking through all of those expectations and making sure that they're on board with them, and nothing is kind of brand new information. Also looking at the different schedules, both in terms of pre-competition and during, and seeing if there's anything unusual that springs up in that. that's different to what they're normally experiencing. Moving on to scenario planning. So this is once you've kind of done all of your list, had all of your discussions, then we kind of move on to the what ifs. So I think the pandemic blew all of our what ifs out the water because we'd never really looked into that. But we always now will. But there's the sort of general things to look at in terms of what if you lose your luggage or your luggage is damaged. I was at Paralympics once when the athlete's wheelchair was dropped coming off the plane and damaged, and we had to figure out how to try and get a replacement wheelchair to her while she used one of the airport wheelchairs, which anyone who works in parasport will know is very different to one that's personalised for an athlete. But having now, after that had happened once, they were then much better prepared for what you would do in the event of that happening again. And unfortunately, with some airline staff, you hope it's never going to happen, but there is a chance that it could. So considering those scenarios around if there's staff or individuals missing. So for instance, if a coach can't travel or a teammate or a partner can't travel, then how will that impact us? What will we do? And then another important one, which kind of goes back to our point about communication, is what if something happens at home, such as a bereavement or an illness? Is that something that the athlete wants to know about in real time, or is that something that they would prefer to find out when they got home or after a certain point in competition? Obviously, we hope this never happens, but if we have these conversations ahead of time, then it just makes that really difficult situation a tiny bit easier. So it's an opportunity for you to ask athletes what they can come up with, anything they have and haven't experienced before, and try and have a wee bit of fun with it, but just make sure that you've been through a few different scenarios so that if they get any curveballs, then it feels like they are more resilient and more prepared than they otherwise would be. And then also just scenario planning around results. So a little bit like I spoke about earlier with the athletes who were in a relationship in terms of one performing well and the other not, but also just more generally looking at how will you feel, what will the future look like, depending on what your performance is and indeed what your results are, which aren't always one and the same thing. And then, of course, how will you feel if others perform well or badly and how that impacts you. And it might seem fairly basic, but I think it is worth considering when you're not in the heat of the moment and you're not at that competition, when you've got a little bit of space to consider those things. And the last one I put there was just around possible media questions and interest. There's if you're like me, then you try not to spend too much time watching the news because it just kind of gets you down. But there might be some things that are worth being aware of that you might get asked that are kind of topical. And yeah, media training in general is a whole other aspect. But just considering what questions you might get asked. I did have one athlete who I was kind of in the room with them when they were taking a phone call that was it was a newspaper interview, I think, and they were asked about their injury that they had acquired, which was due to medical negligence, and they were kind of asked at that point, do you still blame the hospital? How do you feel about that? Those sorts of things, and that was something that was obviously pretty traumatic or pretty personal to the athlete, and they hadn't necessarily thought it was going to come up in a media interview a day before competition. They thought the focus was going to be on how do you think you're going to do tomorrow, that sort of thing. But the media aren't always that way inclined, and if there's a story to be had, then that's what they're looking for. So sometimes it might be you kind of seeing into the future if you possibly can, and predicting some of the more difficult media questions that might be put their way. Or even if you're not making predictions, even if you're just thinking, if you get asked any question that you don't particularly want to answer, then what is your strategy for just kind of answering something you do want to answer, as most politicians, but also well-experienced athletes do as well. So that is coming up to the end of the hour and kind of the end of the things I had. Just while you guys are thinking, if you've got any questions, I guess I'll do a little bit of a recap. So in terms of preparing athletes for competition, we're looking at them being as confident in their preparations as possible, so that A, they can focus on their performance, but B, so that they can have a positive experience regardless of their performance or indeed results. We're looking at some of the kind of nuts and bolts of that in terms of providing them with lists, checklists, discussion points, but then hopefully there's an opportunity for us to have those one-to-one conversations where we're digging a little bit deeper about some other considerations they might not have had before, but also about understanding themselves and others, how they can communicate that information and how they can flex in a pressured situation to the needs of others as well. Also looking at their own expectations as well as the sport they're with expectations, the different scenarios that might play out while they're there, and as we began, what is going to happen next for that athlete in terms of their rest and recovery, in terms of potentially optimizing their profile, or in terms of what is next for them and either their sporting performance or their employment, education, or whatever is on the cards. So hopefully, since I've waffled for an extra wee minute, you've had a chance to come up with some questions that you may have. Please feel free to chuck your video on or microphone on, put your hand up, or give me a shout with anything you'd like.
Joe, do you want to come with your question?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, thanks for that. That was really helpful. I just wondered where the balance is between, obviously, as in sort of lifestyle practitioner hat on, you always talk about empowering athletes to sort of solve problems themselves and things like that, and you know, so they become self-sufficient. I suppose, how do you square that off yourself when obviously you're trying to take all the pressure away from them so they can concentrate on the competition or sport, etc., but while still trying to sort of develop these athletes that aren't reliant on, you know, like I know you said it's also idiot proofing a bit, isn't it, which it needs to be, but how do you square that off? Just interested.
Yeah, no, really good question, and it is the kind of chicken egg situation, and I think for me it kind of depends on the relationship I have both with the athlete but also with the sport in terms of how new I am and how well I know that sport. So for me personally, if I'm quite new into that environment, then I try not to make any assumptions about what the athletes already do, and I try and just add value and give the option of using tools or engaging in discussion if they want. So that might be a situation where I kind of would send out some of the templates, kind of like the one I shared, of these are some things that you might want to consider. This is when I'm available to chat about it, etc. And then that's when, like you say, is a little bit idiot proof, is a little bit just sort of holding someone's hand through the whole thing. But hopefully, if most of you have been in your roles for a wee bit longer and you're a wee bit more familiar with the athletes and the sport, then you kind of know where to put your energies. So it might be some athletes that others need more help, and actually to try, and there'll be athletes who just need a wee bit of reminding. Have you done that? There's athletes that need a little bit of empowering. Oh, remember I helped you with that last time, but I'm assuming you're on it this time, kind of thing, and making sure they're there. And there'll be athletes that, you know, you've tried to empower about 17 times before and it still hasn't really worked that well. And for them, it might be worth just kind of doing the hand-holding section. But I think it also depends on the level of competition they're going to. And I think that, you know, for me, there is value in people failing and people forgetting things and people getting things wrong, particularly if they're not at the pinnacle of their career. You know, so giving them space to fail, for lack of a better phrase, I think is a good thing. But I think once we're going into the really heightened competitions, then any kind of stress you can take away from that athlete, any kind of confidence you can give them by assuring them, yeah, you have done all of these things, and maybe doing almost like a little bit more hand-holding, is worthwhile, because that's not the time to fail. That's not the time to forget your accreditation, or to get yourself flustered, or to kind of have really bad sleep, or whatever it is. So hopefully they've had opportunities to grow and learn. You have opportunities to empower them, and then when it gets to those majors, then you might just put a bit more time and energy into hand-holding than you otherwise would. But it depends how many athletes you're looking after, I guess.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I have
Yeah.
one. Well, go
Oh,
on.
no, beat you to it.
You jump in, Elsa. Sorry, Alice, you jump in.
Yeah, so I guess like mine would be a little bit from if you're working in a sport where you've got like games every week, or like more frequently maybe than like the big competitions. Like everything that you were saying around like the pre-comp, post-comp at the very start resonated with me with regards to like pre-season. Like that's quite a time to have conversations and stuff. But I guess once you sort of get stuck into, say, like the season where you've got games every week and some weeks you've got 2 games, like is there any bits that you were saying like that you'd say would carry on and be your thread, that you'd have those conversations more regularly, because you almost don't want to be having those conversations every week, because obviously it's not quite as maybe needed as much as when you've got big competitions that are further apart? Like would you say the best ways to do it is to like pick up on it every few weeks and do like a bit of a reflection and then change anything that's needed, or would there be certain bits that you'd focus on at different times in a season? I'm just trying to sort of like think about how I could start to implement some of the things that you've said.
Yeah, I think it depends how much contact time you have with the players in general, and sometimes that is to do with your role, but sometimes it's to do with the specific player. So there might be a player that you have a catch up with every single week just because they're a wee bit more kind of high support needs, and if that was the case, then it might just be one of your kind of standing agenda items, if you like, of how do you think your prep was this week. Like, did you nail your basics? Did you do what we discussed, etc.? But if it's someone who you didn't ordinarily talk to on a week-to-week basis, then I'd probably be looking if there was kind of a mid-season point where you could do so kind of pre-season, mid-season, and then end of like regular season, but prior to any kind of majors coming up, to any of the big tournaments, so that you can kind of be like, okay, what have we learned? And how can we utilize that exactly, or how does that change slightly for the bigger competitions we're about to go into? But yeah, I appreciate your season is pretty relentless, but also pretty long. There's not a huge kind of off season either, so it's not one of those ones where you're like, oh, we'll just do it all in off season, because actually you kind of need to leave them alone in that period sometimes. So yeah, I think I would be looking for, with the majority, I'd be looking for a couple of touch points. Pre-season, like you say, mid-season, prior to the big tournaments. But if there was an athlete who you supported generally anyway, then it might just be one of your agenda items. It doesn't necessarily need to be a long conversation, but it's just kind of standing.
Cool. Thank you.
No worries.
I suppose I was going to ask one around I really like the personality profile and cheat sheets with energy plan, self-care, and then managing relationships. As a process, when would you recommend going through that with the athlete, especially around knowing and understanding a foreign environment in terms of, not knowing much about the context, I suppose?
So in terms of the kind of knowing yourself and knowing others bit, I would be trying to do that minimum kind of 2 months before, and that is ideal world if you presented your plan to the coach and they agreed to everything, which isn't always the way that works. But yeah, I would be trying to do it a couple of months before, partly because of the headspace, and partly just so that there's time for them to really kind of go away, have a think, and then come back to you and kind of be like, actually, like I've changed my mind a wee bit on that. That's not actually how that worked, or no, I think that's slightly different, or I've actually been trying that approach with that particular athlete or coach. And and it's not worked the way that we discussed as a group. But yeah, the other reason I would try and do it a wee bit before is the way I've done it previously is myself and the psych have kind of divided and conquered, and we've had an individual conversation with each athlete. So let's say kind of 20, 30 athletes, and then we've put our heads together and then had a group session. So logistically, just to allow enough time to do individual sessions and then meaningful group sessions, and decide whether you kind of need one group session, or actually if a series of 3 half-an-hours would be better, then making sure that there is time to kind of fit that into the diary. In terms of thinking about the context of where you're traveling to, then it probably depends how extreme that is. So if you're traveling to somewhere like Tokyo, then people will have been talking to you about heat and jet lag for months and months and months before, and you've probably been in humidity chambers and all that sort of thing. But in terms of actually kind of getting into the culture and the language and things like that, that's sometimes something that I've done really close to the event, because it's almost kind of like a nice distraction. Like, it doesn't really matter if they can speak Japanese or not, but it just is kind of something to get a little bit excited about, and something that's not, you know, just talking about what their current weight is or what their current PB is or whatever. So sometimes it's been put in there as a preparation thing, but actually it's more of like a positive distraction thing.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I suppose when I was talking about foreign environment, that could even be like Birmingham in terms of like a new hotel. And like I suppose it goes back to your lists and having those tastes of home in terms of teas, coffees. Like I travel with coffee wherever I go, just for that familiarity and trying to create a sense of normality, I suppose. Anila, thank you so much for this evening. It was really insightful into especially the way you kind of set it out in terms of, right, actually, let's look at the end point and get them to focus on what could be next. It's something I know some of my athletes really struggle with, those post-game blues, and sometimes it's, you know, that's an exit out of the sport, and there is a sense of loss. So thank you for being so open and honest and sharing that sort of journey with us. It was really insightful, so I appreciate your time. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining us on an evening. We will also be sending the video out like for like 30 days, and then it will come down. But thank you again for all your time. It was nice having you on this evening.
Thanks so much, Ralph, and thanks everyone for turning up. Appreciate it. I'm sick of my voice now, so hopefully you are too. See you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.